Thank you very much for joining us. Over 140 people have signed up for today's session. Our discussion today takes the place of an event that we had hoped would occur in November in person in Galway. But as with so much during the year of COVID, rethinking was in order. Indeed, we have heard much over the past year about resilience as an imperative during COVID-19. But reimagining is just as important. The word captures both the challenges and the opportunities posed by the crisis. Specifically, our aim today is to consider not just the European capitals of culture, but also universities within them as a part of a network. NUI Galway has been in the fortunate position of being official legacy partner with Galway 2020, and I've served as chair of the University Steering Committee and have witnessed firsthand the remarkable energy that this bid has released and the huge opportunity it created for collaboration with so many different arts groups, institutions, and individuals in Galway, both the city and the county as a whole. One of the most remarkable features of this relationship has been the university's role in supporting the volunteering side of the project, a massive undertaking in itself. The university has also sponsored the research fellowship of Stephen Hadley, as well as a whole series of projects which will be coming to fruition over the course of the next year. Naturally, we have shared the frustration over the curtailment of aspects of the program, but we have also admired the resourcefulness of colleagues in Galway 2020 in adapting. In looking forward, we want to build on these relationships to make Galway once more a vital destination for audiences, artists, and researchers committed to the arts and culture. The university is at the heart of this. I'd now like to introduce our panelists, and I'll do so in the order in which they're going to be speaking. So first of all, Professor Flora Carrijn is president of UNIC, the University Network of European Capitals of Culture. This organization unites over 50 universities from 20 different countries. In her spare time, Flora is Provost and Academic Director at KU Leuven, Belgium's leading university and one of the top research institutions in Europe. Her own background is in cognitive linguistics, and she's a great advertisement for the contribution that humanities scholars can make at the highest level, not just in UNIC, but also in her many roles, including serving as Managing Director of the Flanders Business School, her work with chambers of commerce, charities, and heritage associations. Carsten Schwereb led preparations for the European Capital of Culture in Malta and addressed cultural matters as the permanent representation of Malta to the EU in Brussels as cultural attaché. He has worked as international projects coordinator with a focus on EU collaboration at the Institute for Tourism, Travel and Culture at the University of Malta, and as project and research manager of the World Heritage Nomination Project at the Maltese Ministry for Culture. Professor Sean Ryder is established professor of English at NUI Galway and head of the School of English and Creative Arts. His many roles have included serving as board member for the Irish Research Council and as chair of HERA, Humanities in the European Research Area. He has held major grants from EU and Irish funding bodies in digital humanities. And our fourth panelist is Ethna Berling. She's director of the Galway City Museum, a role she has held since 2013. Ethna began her professional life as an archaeologist. After serving as curator of the Donegal County Museum, she worked with the Heritage Council. In 2016, she became a member of the bid team for the European Capital of Culture for Galway and wrote the cultural strategy. This assignment led her to become involved in Culture 21 Pilot Cities project. She has led the Galway City Museum expansion project, which secured a €10 million funding package in 2019 for the redevelopment and extension of the site. Thank you very much to all of you for joining us. I wanted to bring in Flora, first of all, as president of UNIC, to share with us some thoughts about the contribution that the organization makes and the relationship between capitals of culture and universities. Flora.
Okay, thank you, Dan, and good afternoon to everyone. I have the pleasure also as president of UNIC to welcome everyone to this webinar and the launching of the online special issue as the innovative and creative substitute for our annual conference this last year. Now, since our last meeting in Matera, our annual conference in November 19, we had been looking forward to meeting up again in Galway, but unfortunately all our lives and good intentions were engulfed by that thorn crown, Corona, COVID-19. Luckily, Our colleagues from the Moore Institute of the National University of Ireland in Galway possessed a strong resilience you have already talked about, but also creativity and dynamism to convince several colleagues from all over Europe to contribute to the online issue as well. Catherine and Patrick, we are grateful for your initiative, which allows us to continue UNIQ's tradition of academic exchange on Europe, culture, and the role of universities in the context of the European Capital of Culture. Now, let me briefly set out some ideas which might be elaborated on in the panel discussion. The present pandemic came in already somewhat troublesome times with Brexit and other dangers of European disintegration over issues such as climate change and energy supply and migration. The European values of democracy, equal opportunities for all, and social responsibility and solidarity came under high stress, as some nation states clearly reiterated themselves as islands within Europe, and political polarization grew in many countries. Furthermore, the indecisiveness of the different member states undoubtedly undermined the clout power of the European Union to tackle the challenges of the pandemic. The implementation of the European motto, in varietate concordia, is shivering as the connecting and emancipatory power of European culture is under threat from political evolutions. More than ever, since the Second World War, are we in need of a common urge to safeguard the security and prosperity of all citizens. It is culture that connects people, individuals and the community, local and global, past and present, ratio and emotion, art and science, tradition and innovation. It is in culture that we encounter each other's identity, learn to respect each other, and learn from one another. Hence, culture and art have a positive, emancipatory, and integrative power that transcends the superficial differences and help us find the core of our humanity and civilization. As such, the initiative of the European Capital of Culture must remain playing an important role to help safeguard this cultural encounter and exchange of ideas and achievements. The present pandemic seems not only to create a danger of discord among nation states, but it has also disrupted social cohesion and solidarity between generations and put a mortgage on many people's social responsibility. Whereas in the beginning, attention was duly concentrated on the physical health of the elderly, authorities have now become more and more aware of the danger to the mental health of the younger generation. Especially at university, students suffer from loneliness and lack of social contact. And social life for students, as we all know, means going to music and theatre performances, watching movies together in the cinema, or having a cantus with fellow students. This clearly illustrates how much our well-being depends on culture. Hence, culture is an integral part of life at university, which is per se an international-oriented environment. Furthermore, it is important for universities to be involved in the ECOC movement of their locality, as it is completely in compliance with their threefold mission of research, education, and service to society or outreach. The cross-fertilization of town and gown, which UNIQ stands for as well, benefits both. Furthermore, and lastly, and this is because we are at the Moore Institute, universities should not only do research on art and culture at a meta level and teach about art, but they also need to do practice-based arts research and provide practice-based teaching. Art does not only depict the world as we perceive it, but it can shape the world. Art can be the mirror of the mind, an instigator of emotions and ideas. Art stimulates consciousness and intellectual growth. As such, art is like a language. Art is a language. Hence, practice-based art education is comparable to academic translation studies, which are normally also part of the arts faculty. I will stop here, Mr. Chairman. I hope I have succeeded in not abusing my allocated time too much, and I'm looking forward to the discussion afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you, Flora. No, you've been admirably on time. And in fact, you've made some not only inspiring remarks, but actually quite challenging ones for us to follow up on. I know that your latter point about practice-based research is something that Sean Ryder is going to come back to. Before we speak to Sean, I wonder if I could bring in Carsten at this point. Carsten, you've had this close involvement with Valletta and Malta. And I wonder if you could talk perhaps about the legacy dimension, which is one thing that we're extremely interested in, both in general as an outcome, because any capital of culture lasts for a year, or perhaps a little bit longer in the case of the COVID-19 moment, by a few months. On the other hand, the legacy is much longer and more durable. So I wonder if you could talk to us about that.
Thank you very much for that. I hope I'm coming through clearly. Very good. I'll try to be brief as well. Valletta, the capital of city of Malta, was capital of culture in 2018. So that's 3 years ago. And yes, speaking of legacy, one might say, as in a recent paper I co-wrote with John Bayer and Maria Vendino at the University of Malta, it might be still too early, or actually it might be also the right time. Also because COVID intervened, as Flora and you also noted, it was a game changer. So on the one hand, one might say, it's a bit too early, one needs to take more time. On the other hand, however, one might say that what seems to be happening with the capital of culture, somehow COVID made more pronounced and made more clear. On the one hand, one might say there was something to come out of 7-8 years of preparation in terms of culture program, funding, activities, internationalization, and many other things one would associate with capitals of culture. However, probably the more visible element up till COVID was the large amount of hotels, restaurants, bars, so the commercial side of a small city like Valletta, which is 1 square kilometer, which struck one. Now, arguably, one could say it did not only happen because of capital of culture, and capital of culture acted as a catalyst for that sort of big push towards making economic and commercial and financial use of the capital city, which up to a few years ago, I remember in my youth, was quite sort of quiet and dormant, more of a government offices, place to be, and obviously the heritage, which was always very, very, very important. But in the last few years, it's really it was really taking sort of a lot of commercial and economic importance up till COVID. So basically, when one goes today, I work there today. It's sort of gone back in a way to the more quiet city it was a while ago, and one then questions and say, so why invest so much in something which was so ephemeral, that something like COVID technically brought to a halt? Could anything else have been done? Was it inevitable that a pandemic would have stopped any type of project? And I guess that's a good question, and the answers are tough. I know today from a state position, but also the private sector, are trying their best to try to sort of reinvent themselves but with cruise liners not traveling anymore to Malta, except one every so often, with shops and the boutique hotels and everything commercially related not being in a position to sort of cater for the thousands of people who want to travel there every day. What is left? And I'm afraid from my position, I see very little being left. Obviously, closed museums don't help. But I feel Valletta has become a little bit of maybe a bit of a shell, seeing so much being done commercially, financially, but very little culturally going on. And now to conclude, I just say sort of having looked at what's been done, what is happening now, looking a bit forward to the future, the sort of local actors are focusing on, well, trying to revive Valletta and the economy of Malta, including the cultural sector, with difficulty, admittedly. In a couple of weeks' time, one of the flagship projects of the Capital of Culture from 3 years ago is officially opening, which is sort of maybe a bit strange in terms of timing as well, because it's bang in the middle of this third sort of wave of the pandemic. Hopefully, it will sort of serve its purpose. It's a design cluster, and hopefully, it will also sort of encourage people to operate maybe not only commercially minded, but also in terms of other forms of collaboration, which today are limited. And then looking ahead, there's already till the end of this month a call open for the national agency taking care of the Capital of Culture to collect application forms for localities to apply for the next Capital of Culture, which is in 9 years' time, in 2030. However, it's a bit of a script already read and film already seen. So it's no secret that sort of officially government has already sort of promoted Gozo, the sister island of Malta, to be the Capital of Culture. And also in a sense of deja vu, we already know what's happening with Gozo, big infrastructural projects, the going ahead with a tunnel to be built between Malta and Gozo, with all the ecological problems that will cause. A lot of building in terms of speculative and flats and apartments. Most symbolic, probably the last one being a block of flats being proposed and being planned to build less than 200 meters away from the oldest man-made freestanding buildings on Earth, Gigantia temples, which are UNESCO sites till now, because we are just going ahead with this building spree. And unfortunately, in a script of deja vu, Capital of Culture seems to be again all geared at mass tourism, so no real attention being paid to discussions about sustainability. It's not really part of our parlance, unfortunately, in Malta, or action. And unfortunately, it's a very sort of centralized, clear, directed, economic and commercially driven with short-term gains. And one wonders, I will conclude with this, if another COVID-19 comes along, if another pandemic happens, but then also, we seem to be very oblivious of this, I'm afraid, locally, climate change, changes in the way we behave and in the way we interrelate with each other within our ecologies, that seems to be completely passing us by. And we're just sort of going to keep on with the old model, hoping that this will keep sort of regenerating some form of economy, which is very set on old channels, on old tracks and old models. I wonder what it will take to actually change this type of mentality. Unfortunately, Capital of Culture Mark I failed the test. It brought no change, I would say, in terms of the two main pillars of Capital of Culture, the relationship of citizens with their city on the one hand, and some sense of infusing a debate on European values, actually rather the opposite. We haven't been immune from populism and very sort of scaremongering type of political approaches. The cultural sector doesn't seem to be really at the priority, and I guess my feeling is it will also serve for more of the same. We'll see. We'll see what the future brings. I hope I haven't gone too far beyond my allocated time. Thank you for the space.
No, not at all. That's extremely interesting. I mean, obviously, the hallmark of this year has been change, and through the catastrophic events that have been visited around the world, obviously not just in Europe, although particularly severe in Europe. So surely there will be some massive changes, and the question then becomes, what will they be, and how creative can we be in responding to these challenges and opportunities? Sean, I wonder if I could turn to you. And as I was saying, there was already anticipated to a certain extent by Flora's remarks about the relationship between practice-based learning and universities as particular guardians and exponents of that set of possibilities. I wonder if you could say something more. You're now head of this relatively new school at NUI Galway, School of English and Creative Arts, at which, and this is really at the center of a lot of the innovative practices that are going on.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. And I will pick up on some of the points that Flora has raised. I thought I'd address myself to this question: how can universities engage in practice-led arts research and teaching in a slightly practical way? And I was thinking, there are kind of three strands to this issue. First of all, you've programs, so you need to establish teaching and research programs that are primarily practice-led or include practice-led teaching and research. And here I think it's important to imagine practice quite broadly. So it includes, yes, performing arts, film, music, creative writing, digital media, and so on, but also trying to bring such practice into innovative contexts, such as, medicine or engineering or science, not just the arts and humanities. So that kind of broad purview, if you like, or attempted impact. So programs is one thing. You also need partnerships. So you need to establish this two-way dynamic where non-university partners bring their expertise to the student experience, and then students and graduates in turn bring their energy and ideas back to the partners or out to the partners. So there's an obvious need to build partnerships with regional creative industries and communities, but also other areas like the IT sector, entrepreneurial hubs, the heritage sector that Etna will talk about, I'm sure, shortly, NGOs, public services, and so on. And the important thing here is that participation and partnership means that the students learn more than just how to apply their creative skills. They also learn about teamwork or business and how to, work within an organization and so on. So there's a kind of very rich learning experience from the student's point of view. And then the third point, programs, partnerships, and then prioritization. For the success and sustainability of practice-led teaching and research, you need a certain commitment from the university itself for the appropriate facilities, for the kind of resourcing that's needed, support for networking activities and funding applications and so on, especially in the startup phase. So you need all of those things to be working together, I think. In terms of what practice-led teaching and practices research means, I think here in Galway for us, I think what's emerging is that I think for us, this is an approach that defines creative practice as a path to understanding. So, the stories we tell, the performative aspects of our lives, the creation of things which are aesthetically beautiful or psychologically provocative or emotionally affecting, all of these things, are products of our creativity, but they're also sources of knowledge. They're ways of understanding ourselves and our world. And so, the practice of creating and performing such work is also a form of knowledge creation. I think that has to be recognized. Like the experimental work, experimental lab work, we'll say, of a scientist or an engineer. And I think, both artists and academics, insofar you can separate those things, sometimes they overlap, but they are always driven by a similar and strong belief that there's something more that needs to be said, something that's insufficiently illuminated. So I think you can argue the artistic path and the academic path, they simply represent different ways of approaching problems or phenomena, or trying to fill some gap in our knowledge or understanding. For example, a practice-based PhD for us in creative writing involves the production of, say, a novel, work of fiction, on a particular theme. We'll say it's the theme of immigration. And then accompanying that, there's a kind of research piece that goes with that, where the student investigates that theme from a scholarly point of view. And then there's a reflective piece in which the student has to try to relate both the academic inquiry and the creative practice in some way, partly to show those overlapping ways of arriving at knowledge, you could say. So, you know, it's other examples we have here of people using performance in order to be involved in educational processes around, say, sexual consent and so on. Or you could imagine somebody taking a short story, creating a digital performance from that story in a way that not only sort of uses the story, but maybe brings us back to that original story, thinking again about that creative work itself, the original creative work, so that practice-based, you know, research becomes kind of like creating a sort of an essay on the original text. So what I'm trying to draw attention to is just the kind of really interesting synergies and overlaps that are there between creative practice and academic inquiry. These things aren't separate. They're not always going in different directions. Just finally, a couple of points. There are challenges to this kind of work. You know, creative practitioners often work on different timetables and different rhythms to the academic calendar. Not all organizations, arts organizations, are in a position to take on interns. There's time costs for that. Practice-based teaching and research requires certain forms of pedagogy and assessment, which have to be carefully designed. Partnerships need to be resilient. You know, they need to last over a period of time. So there are definitely challenges to you know, undertaking this kind of work. Having said all that, you know, I think our standpoint in the school is that universities should be key players in the artistic and cultural ecosystem of a city or a region. And that's to speak to the point that Flora has already raised very eloquently. In a sense, that already has been happening in Galway. It's been happening for a long time. It's just that it hasn't been structured and formalized in a way. And I think now is the opportunity to do that. The university itself has, as part of its strategic planning, the values of creativity, the idea of mehel, collaboration and cooperation and partnership. And, you know, we already have a number of programs which are trying to explore this in terms of drama, film, creative writing, and creative arts in the curriculum project we have running as well. Galway is an ideal situation for this, not only a very vibrant, lively creative sector, but it's a multilingual environment. You know, both national languages flourish here, as well as the languages of newer immigrant communities. We have a vibrant IT sector, heritage sector, and Galway is not just a city, but a region. And this is kind of interesting, I think, from the capital of culture point of view. You know, we draw upon the strengths of a wider, you know, community outside the city as well. And that can be a strength as well as a challenge that we should draw upon here in Galway. So anyway, that's my kind of general thoughts on this. And just finally, you know, I think the vision that we are developing here, I think, is based on the idea that the university, like the arts, is a public good. And it's not reducible simply to economic value, though of course economic value is an important aspect of all of this. But it's economic value along with health and societal well-being. Again, Flora has drawn attention to these. Innovative thinking, imagining possible futures, and also coming to terms with our knowledge of the past. These are all things that we do in the university, and they're also things that connect us to the wider community. And, you know, a vision of creative practice-based, you know, or practice-led teaching research should, I think, embody these values. So that's my initial comments. Thank you.
Thanks, Sean. That's extremely helpful, and I think has raised a lot of points I'd love to pursue. Hopefully, we'll get a little bit of a chance. I liked your emphasis on the sources of knowledge that are generated by artistic and academic research in combination. I think that's quite an important point. But I think it also reminds us of the elements of entrepreneurship, which are so closely associated with that practice, but often not recognized as such, and indeed of innovation. So we might come back to those questions if we have time. So Etna, I wonder if I could turn to you now, and you bring a unique perspective because of your role in the Galway City Museum, which is really at the absolute heart of the city. And you've been working in so many different forms of collaboration over the course of your career, not alone in the time that you spent in Galway. So I wondered if you could talk to us a little bit about your perspective on this interesting and dynamic set of relationships at the heart of the work you're doing.
Thank you, Dan. I'm going to try and show you something first, if this will work for me. Can you see that?
It's working, yes.
Okay, so I was just going to start with the specific and then move to something a little wider, but Carsten might be interested in this. So this is an exhibition that we put together for for Galway 2020, and it's called Monument, and it's about large monuments on small islands in Europe. And the reason we started, I suppose I got interested in this is, as Dan said, I'm an archaeologist, and have been enthralled to the Aran Islands for a long time, as many people have been for centuries before me. But we have particularly wonderful forts, 7 massive forts on these very small islands. So I was very interested in the whole idea of ambition of communities, small communities, really big ambition. And we started to look around Europe. And so one of the, if I can just go in there a little bit, we looked at 12 islands in Europe, some of them absolutely tiny, like Gavrinis, which is off the coast of Brittany, which is just a passage tomb, essentially a massive passage tomb, Neolithic passage tomb. But we also looked at the temples of Gozo. So if I can pull in here a little bit, you might be able to see them, Kirsten, there on the, they normally light up. We have a whole animation going with this, but if you see where my cursor is there, you're well represented. You're just after our spectacular fort out in the Aran Islands, which we are very attached to, this rather enigmatic fort called Dunengasa. So I suppose in looking at this, we also created a new map and a new way of looking at the map, so that we weren't always this remote kind of outpost, on the edge of Europe. But instead, when we turned the map on its side, as you can see there, we actually, became the center of Europe. And we were very pleased with that positioning. And then we blew up all the islands so that you could see them, so that they became much more magnified. And so we have a whole story then attached to this map, which looks at trade routes, how people got around Europe, where they got their copper, their bronze, their tin, all those kind of things, and looked at amber beads from, from the Baltic and so on. So, and then if we just very quickly look down here, I can't bring you any further, sadly, into the exhibition, but further down we have a combination of objects from Dunengasa, this very celebrated fort out in the Aran Islands. And then we commissioned a whole lot of artists to make work for us, to respond to the islands, and to respond to the the majesty of the islands, but also, and like you can see there, we have glass work by Roisin de Butler, and we have textiles, and we have a whole lot of beautiful ceramics, and this lovely geometric bench, and so on. But I suppose really what I wanted to talk about in relation to that was what was marvelous for us looking at this exhibition was that it looked at the whole idea of endurance and sustainability, and everything now for me is about sustainability. I'll just see if I can stop sharing for a moment. Yeah. So so looking at that, I suppose also looking at the whole cultural planning piece when we were talking about, when we were looking at Monument, but when I was also involved then in the bid team and in writing the cultural strategy for the city and county and for our bid, which it was a prerequisite, and that was the piece about what will sustain, what has sustained. And one of the places we looked first was Culture 21, which is local agenda, which is Agenda 21 for culture. And that is a wonderful organisation and movement, I suppose, really. And we became one of the pilot cities in that. And I learned so much from that, because you've got really big brain European people looking at this, at culture and the sustainability of culture. So we adopted the principles of Culture 21 and brought them into our very speedily written cultural strategy for Galway. And the pilot cities, of course, what was really key in that is that they are the United Cities and local governments is what they are, and they look at the relationship explicitly between citizens, culture, and sustainable development. So this became, I suppose, the foundation of what we wanted to articulate in our bid, and thankfully then, of course, we were successful. And I left and went back to the museum, but all the time thinking about this whole sustainability thing. And, looking then, Monument came in, we did our exhibition, and unfortunately, of course, we closed, and we will reopen that quite soon, we hope. But looking at what came out of that in terms of sustainability, and one of the marvelous things that came out was volunteers. There's an absolutely sterling volunteer program is attached to Galway 21. Galway 2020. And of that, like maybe 600 or 800 people who were involved in that, about nearly 200 people have remained with it and want to stay with it. So that's a huge legacy piece, and that's very sustaining as well for the city. I think it's a huge asset for the city that cannot be underestimated. I suppose one thing we have learned in Galway, sadly, is that we have a huge absence of infrastructure. We're very, very poor on cultural infrastructure, sound cultural infrastructure. And we had hoped, I suppose, to be a lot further on. At this stage with that, the museum, as you know, we've secured a lot of money for that, but other pieces we hoped would be in position are not, but it looks like they may come. But what's more important, I think, really, is the soft infrastructure and is the capacity that has been built by the by the whole ECOC and Galway 2020 effort. There has been massive, really good capacity, very solid capacity building. That's been a lot of it, which has been done with the university as part of the university, but also with the third level sector generally, and with the artistic and creative community. So there's been an awful lot of innovation and kind of new thinking, and wonderful creativity has emerged from that, and collaborative part. And one of the things we wanted to talk about, and we did talk about in the cultural strategy, was this, what I call a self-leveling suspension. I used to drive an old Mercedes, and it has this built-in self-leveling suspension. And I always kind of think about that when you're thinking about building cultural hubs, is that you need a self-leveling suspension. You need, and for it to be sustainable, you have to keep your operational costs low. So we looked at a lot of that, I suppose, and I think going forward, like one of the only shows in town now is climate change. And I am completely fixated on that, even in the museum. And we're looking at funding to do a new climate gallery and a whole climate exhibition, just so that we can get the message out about it. And I think it really behoves us. I think Carsten mentioned that as well. I think it really behoves us that we have to start to build really enduring and sustainable pieces for all of our creativity, and looking at our children and our students, giving them the I suppose the smarts, which is the kind of third level, job, but it's also building in that understanding about budgets and about, recycling and about reuse and about green economy and about all those kind of pieces, helping them with all of that, I think, because we kind of got them into this mess, and we've got to try and help them to get out of it. I also think strategic planning, it's a huge, I love that whole area of strategic planning, but I think that is part of this, is the strategic planning part of it. And so that it's not short-termism, which our governments are so, we can be so critical of them for. It's just for having a longer, master planning in terms of the cultural piece. What do we need? What do they need? How are we going to make it work? What kind of fuel are they going to use to warm these buildings? What kind of materials are they going to use? Are they safe? All those kind of things. And I suppose going back as well to, I think, what Sean was talking about there, this whole multidisciplinary approach, because the more I collaborate, the more I want to collaborate, the more you share, the more benefits you get back, the kinder you are, the kinder everyone is to you. So I think that's a huge part of it as well, is that you're sharing, everyone is in this. We saw what fabulous kind of results we've had in the last year in terms of the progress with vaccines. That's all of that is achievable. It's just to marshal, I suppose, our thoughts, and to get the strategic piece, right. And finally, to kind of go back to the monument and the cultural piece again, which a huge graw for, which is the Irish word for love, is this idea, and Dan has heard me speaking about this before, is this whole idea about showcasing the West of Ireland. We feel we have such a unique product here. It's an awful tourism word, but we have such a unique place, and we have such a huge variety of sources of inspiration for people, which we've been on the European tour since the mid to late 1800s. We've drawn so many, we've attracted so many playwrights and writers and artists and makers and movers and all that kind of thing. It's to find, I think, a showcase for all of that, because we have such wonderful, rich culture here. I'd love to see that happening as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Etna. Yeah, well, I think we're very fortunate to have you here working in Galway because you're bringing so many things together. I mean, most people I think would collapse at the thought of all the strategic documents and initiatives you've been responsible for. And we're all very much looking forward to the expansion of the museum too. I don't quite know how it's going to happen because I see the space there, but it looks exciting. So, and that will certainly add to the infrastructure side of that you were mentioning, because there is a tremendous need for that, as you were pointing out. So I might invite everybody to kind of, put the cameras back on, and we'll start our sort of general discussion side of things. And for our attendees, by all means, send questions in through the Q&A function. We're going to be coming a little bit later to the launch of a journal that Patrick Lonergan and Catherine Morris have edited. So that's something to look forward to, but we have time for a few questions and things that we can contemplate in the meantime. So I wanted to begin with Flora, if I might come back to you at the beginning. Oh, your hand is up. Oh, it's going back. And to ask you a little bit about, I think this is a theme that was emerging in the discussion, was the kinds of definitions of the value of culture that have come into play and in prominence, particularly in the moment of COVID-19. What has struck you in this context? Certainly there's been a strong emphasis on well-being, and I think well-being has almost come to the center stage as something which is a way of affirming culture and cultural production and cultural consumption. Do you think that's one of the key terms, or which values would you point to as supporting culture in this particular moment?
I think culture is the driving force to make us conscious of ourselves and the needs of society. And especially in these times, I think we are experiencing times where it's important to go deeper and think about our whole existence. And I think that is also what Ethne is trying to show, that with the importance, or having a different look at things by changing the map and pointing out that small aspects, small islands play a large role, have a large history, heritage and things like that. And together they form this whole patchwork that makes our world more sustainable. Sustainable is the word that she used a number of times. And I think it's very important to see that at this moment, what we are striving for, in fact, is to build a more sustainable world, a more inclusive world, an equitable world. And there it's important to know that innovation, that we are living in a whole intricate complex of a creative innovation system in which art plays a role, science, technology, but also art and culture. And instead of trying to put everything in a different basket, we have to put them all together. And when I hear someone involved in museum talk about the importance of climate change, or how to tackle climate change, I think we are on the right track there. And this is, at this moment, with the pandemic, try to find out what is our individual responsibility towards other individuals, but also our social responsibility to society, to nature, and to our future. And that is what the pandemic has forced us to do, to think more.
Thank you. Actually, I think the question also for Etna, maybe in that context, do you think that the COVID-19 crisis has made it harder to imagine the challenges of climate change and sustainability, or made it more pressing? Is it an issue which has overwhelmed everyone's attention and then made it more difficult in that sense? Or do you think there are ways of accessing this as a more pressing issue?
I mean, I think it is unbelievably pressing. And as soon as we are, as soon as we're out of the traps with the vaccines, I think it's just going to really hit us. And it's going to be all anyone's talking about, in my view, because I think it is the only show in town. I think what's really the globalization aspect of the pandemic, I think, has been really salutary for us. And in actual fact, in a weird kind of way, it couldn't have happened at a better time, because we know there's all sorts of ways of fast tracking things. There's loads of people with loads of money, with really like loads of money. And they're not going to see that. Well, they're starting to think, well, maybe actually the planet burning is more important than my money. So they're starting to, to put their money where their mouths are, literally. And I think it's going to really focus people's minds. And I think there's going to be an awful lot of resources going into it. But I think for what role can we play in Galway, or what can I do? I want to be ready with the right information for people so that they're not overwhelmed. Because I feel overwhelmed a lot of the time, and I'm overwhelmed from my kids, and I'm trying to think, what can I tell them to say, okay, this is actually what we're going to do, or this is how we can do it. And I think that's what I'd like to do, is to even just start with the message, having the right message to say, okay, it's really like scary, but this and good information about good science, not bad science. It is down to energy, and this is how we can improve it. And what can we do in Ireland when China and America are doing so much? Like, what good is it, to break it down so that there is a personal responsibility aspect to it? So I suppose that's what I'm kind of focused on,
Oh, I think that makes sense. And I suppose this moment is one where there's a recognition of individual responsibility as well as collective responsibility, the role of government, of interactive action to solve a major crisis. So maybe that gives us a little bit of hope that we can tackle grand challenges, which, as I think you were hinting, might have otherwise seemed very abstract and impossible to contend with. Carsten, I wanted to ask you a slightly different question, which was really a theme of what you were talking about, which is how can capitals of culture reimagine their purpose? Now, some of this is going to be hard to say because we don't know what the long-term effects will be, but surely it's the case that one cannot just carry on with a traditional set of programs and events. Where do you see the kind of changes occurring? And you've indicated a little bit about what you'd like to see, but maybe you could say a little bit more about that.
Thanks for that question. It's really hard to answer. There's been a lot of discussion for more than 20 years now on what capitals of culture could do to be more, in a way, engaged with the populations of cities, more relevant, not only to the present, but also to the future. So I think, although on the one hand, from a technical perspective, one understands the whole systems of panels, monitoring panels, people having to read through hundreds of pages of dossiers and all that. I think we've really sort of left behind possibly the idea which sort of Mercury and Jack Lang had in the mid-80s of trying to envision some form of place and space and particular location on the European map, which can make us imagine our cultural future. I think we're very far from that. It's become a very, I find, technical and technocratic exercise, where you've got to have programs and budgets and people ensuring for everything that is done. Lots of time spent on that element, which I fully understand. But then one wonders and says, why do we need a capital of culture for? If at the end of the day, cities still get the prize. Nation states, member states are coming up with their own capitals of culture, which on the one hand is a good thing. But then one wonders and say, is this a bit counterproductive? Was it supposed to be something for the Europeans? How is it now? Italy has its own show, and the UK has its own show, and has it outside of the EU. And even in Tiny Malta, we're going to have our own show. So do we really still need this European Cup culture? Where is the value of that? And sometimes I compare it a bit with what happens with UNESCO, because now, as you mentioned, I'm more in that field, working on sort of somehow identifying the outstanding universal value of in this case, Maltese sites. And I think it's very nice and useful to speak about tourism and numbers and everything that goes with that. But I think sometimes we end up having lots of effort devoid of meaning. What is the real value added of having a cultural project, which, as you mentioned, and other speakers before me mentioned, where you really try to reimagine the way we relate to each other? Whereas Europe today, even because of COVID, is divided again on nationalistic lines, where vaccines are bought separately from one another. And the politicians are always afraid of battering, like the CSU, CDU suffered yesterday in Germany, of doing the wrong thing and being voted out. And I'm afraid that culture is not immune from all that. And somehow, I think a real good revision of it would be needed, would be called for.
Yeah, I think one of the points that I would take from that, which I think resonates with COVID-19, is my own view is that COVID-19 is really ultimately about the order of values. It's a philosophical problem. It can be treated as a scientific problem. It's ultimately one about the order of values. And I think that's consistent with some things that Flora was saying. Sean, if I could come to you and maybe bring Flora in as well on this, about the importance of networks and how they work. I think universities are particularly good at this. And not to say that artists aren't. I think artists are terrific at it too, but we have certain institutional resources that we bring in network building. And that does seem to be a resource, and also something which is very compatible with that vision of European capital of cultures, which, to pick up on Karsten's point, they might just be little points of light that suddenly disappear once their year is over. Universities are quite good at making them lasting in a certain kind of way. So I wondered if you might just comment on your relationship to networks and how you see universities working within them.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. I'll just briefly, I think that, yes, on the one hand, universities have the capacity to develop networks, and they have sometimes the resources to do that. And they have the people who are committed to doing that within the universities too. It's not always as easy as it might seem, or it might sound sometimes, because there are some strong relationships that can be built up. But there is also the other thing in the university, a tendency historically for the university to be a little bit sort of self-enclosed. I mean, it's the old cliche of the ivory tower, but it does have, the way in which, we'll say, teaching and research programs have been designed often in the past has not really necessarily encourage networking at the scale that it could be done. So there's that challenge from the university's side. And then in terms of the wider community too, and the kinds of partnerships that you want to build, sometimes there are moments where the university rhythms or university structures don't exactly match up with the structures and rhythms and practices in a partner organization. So work has to be done. It's always a process. And sometimes those partnerships take different forms. But I do think I'm encouraged by the fact that I think that there is a recognition nowadays in universities that they must be, developing these networks. There's funding available at European and sometimes national level to do these things. And really it all comes down to this basic value that we need to be working collectively to deal with these big problems like climate change that people have mentioned already. That has to be done in a very multidisciplinary way, and not just multi-academic disciplines, but also in cooperation with, private sector, public sector, and education. So it's crucial, and I would hope that this can be a prime value really in our own university as well.
Yeah, thank you. Actually, I think that's very well observed. Flora, we're going to turn in a moment to the launch of the journal, but I wonder if I could ask you about the networks dimension, which is obviously utterly crucial and is indeed part of the name of the...
They are absolutely crucial, of course, but I think there are two kinds of networks. You have the scientific networks of every individual academic, and there have always been networks like this. If you look at the universities in the Middle Ages, I think we had more foreign professors in the Middle Ages than we have now. Well, not exactly, but I mean, there's always been that kind of network. There are, of course, also the other networks, such as UNIQ, which are transdisciplinary and are more concentrated on structural partnerships. And then next to that, the scientific or the academic networks, I think it's very important, as Sean also mentioned, are the partnerships with the authorities, with the governments, and with industry. Because together we have to work towards a sustainable future, and we need each other there. It's also important to have a good relationship with government, because especially for education in Europe, and education is in the same situation as art. That is that if we do not get subsidies from the governments, this means that education and art would be for the rich people only. And I think it's one of the values of Europe to create equal opportunities, which means that it's a collective responsibility of the countries to invest in culture and education. And in that sense, I think that we have to struggle and keep struggling for having art, culture, and education as a common good. And I think in Europe we're convinced of it, but we hope that we can keep those European values and the implementation of it.
Yeah, thank you very much. We're going to turn now to the launch of the journal that has been edited by Patrick Lonergan and Catherine Morris. So if I could ask you to turn on your cameras, I'm going to say an introduction to Patrick and to Catherine, and also to Ananya Rajoo, who is one of the contributors to the volume. So we're kind of almost back to front in the sense that Catherine and Patrick have been absolutely essential in Galway's relationship to the University Network of European Capitals of Culture. So we're acknowledging you at the end when we should really have placed you at the beginning, but that's characteristic of your role of supporting this whole endeavor. And you've made this interesting intervention by solving the problem of not being able to meet in person by drawing together academic research and creating the kind of conversation and dialogue. So just a word of introduction before I turn to you for some comments on what you did. So Patrick, my colleague, is Professor of Drama and Theatre Studies at NUI Galway. He's a member of the Royal Irish Academy. Patrick has edited and written many books on Irish drama and theatre, the most recent of which is Irish Drama and Theatre Since 1950, published by Bloomsbury in 2019. And he's working at present on a book on Shakespeare and the modern Irish theatre. I might also note that he's had a close involvement with the Abbey Theatre Digital Archive, including the online publication of the Abbey Theatre Minute Books from 1904 to 1939. Catherine Morris is a writer and academic. She lectures in practice-based art subjects in creative writing, modernist theatre practice, curation, and playwriting at NUI Galway and UCD. She has published Alice Milligan and the Irish Cultural Revival. Her narrative poem In Mexico City, A Woman Said was written and performed during Galway 2020's Home Truths exhibition. And she was Liverpool Central Library's first writer in residence, where she worked on an experimental memoir, Intimate Power, Autobiography of a City. And Ananya Rajoo is an artist from Kerala, India, and she's currently based in Galway, where she's producing projects with a focus on cultural heritage. And she's currently pursuing an MA in Creative Arts, producing and curation from NUI Galway. Her dream, she says, is to be an artist and curator-producer to strengthen the intrinsic connection between the works of art and audience building. So Patrick, if I could start with you to say a little bit about this decision to say, right, we can't meet in person, but that can't be the end of, into the relationships we've built.
Yeah, I mean, yes. So it was very upsetting for everyone when we couldn't bring Unique to Galway in November as we had planned to do. And, you know, particularly Catherine had spent like literally years working with people like Flora to try and make this happen. So I think we knew that we wanted to build on the work that had been done. But I think also what the pandemic has done is to allow us to think about space in some interesting ways, where on the one hand, you know, here in Ireland, we're all restricted to a 5-kilometer circle around our houses that we cannot escape from. And, you know, so we've all realized all of the interesting things that are within our 5K, but we're also kind of bored of those things at this stage. So that's one thing, you know, space has become very kind of compressed, but at the same time, what COVID has shown us, as if we didn't already know it, is that scientific innovation only really happens when we cooperate across borders and when we work together internationally. That's how the vaccine has been created. And yes, there has been vaccine nationalism, but, you know, science works best when people cooperate. So we knew we wanted to do something. The journal special issue, it's, you know, there are academic articles in there, but there are also conversations that we had, because we want to capture that thing that happens at conferences where you have a spontaneous conversation with somebody over coffee. And we wanted to include students from Galway, students from elsewhere in Europe. And that's why it's brilliant to have people like Ananya contributing to the special issue as well. So I don't want to say too much more, except just to thank particularly Flora for all of the support with Unique. We're sorry we can't welcome you to Galway, but come here when you can, and you will get a warm welcome. I'd also like to thank David Kelly for all the work he did in getting this material up online. Thank my colleague Dan for everything that the Moore Institute does for us, and also my brilliant co-editor and colleague Catherine Morris as well. So we look forward to welcoming you to Galway, but we hope you enjoy this issue. And let me hand over to Catherine, I think, now.
Yeah, Catherine, thank you. Thank you very much for Catherine, talk about your experience in editing this issue and bringing it together. Oh, you're muted, I think, Catherine. Yeah.
Hello. Yeah, it's been a really wonderful experience. Incredible, really. The people from all across Europe could engage under such extreme circumstances and challenging circumstances to the issue. And I suppose that, while the designation of a capital of culture, can create huge conversations within cities, I think that the pandemic and the very kind of tireless, impressive frontline workers have shown us that really how we measure the success of a capital of culture is not necessarily in tourist numbers alone. A great capital of culture is rooted in a vision of equality and parity of esteem. And that's something that has come across all the way through in the conversation today in this really wonderful webinar, and also in the contributions and conversations that Patrick and I have had, and certainly that the students' work envisages. So a major legacy for a European capital of culture is one that invests in cultural heritage and in its national cultural institutions, its archives, and, as Ethna was saying, in its infrastructure, in the living conditions for its populations, including its students, artists, cultural practitioners, writers, and cultural workers, so that they can not only be educated in the way that Sean was talking about there, in terms of practice-based learning in the universities, but have a pathway into careers with access to affordable places to live and to generate and to show new work. An investment in artist studios as spaces to make work over not just months, but very long periods of time. And when we hear in these conversations the long time that people need to make work, investment in permanent galleries, storage, public libraries, publishing houses, theatres, theatre workshops, spaces for festivals to store and to make new work. These are all issues that are touched on in the people who have engaged with the special issue. And while we didn't manage to bring the University Network of European Capitals of Culture, or indeed our partners in the European Cultural Parliament to Galway this year, we remain committed to that pan-European conversation, and we hope that this journal is a forum to further that conversation in the future. So really, thank you so much to everybody who's brought this together with us.
Yeah, and I suppose no conversation in this context can go past without mentioning Brexit, but you have both your British connections, but I'm glad that this European dimension, which is so important to the world of universities and the world of art together. I mean, is there anybody in those spheres who doesn't recognize the imperative there? We'll leave that for the moment, but I want to turn to Ananya and to ask you just a few questions about your contribution. So I think it's one of the wonderful aspects of this journal is to think, yes, let's have students into the conversation as well. And so you're working on your MA project, and I just wanted to ask you a little bit about the contribution that you made. So you've chosen to study on the MA in curating and producing. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, that was partly because you knew that the capital of culture was going to be taking place, and yet the global pandemic has, as we know, somewhat derailed things. So yeah, how did that impact on your creative work and what you contributed to the journal? The sudden change of circumstances or reversal of fortune.
Yeah, so my work to the journal basically talks about how I try to engage digitally with a work that was produced for Galway 2020 called The Deeper Shades of Green. So after I came here, I was quarantining for 14 days since I traveled from India. And during that time, I had to produce a work for one of the courses that I was doing, where I had to engage with an artwork in Galway 2020. So 2 works from The Deepest Shades of Green were available online, and I was engaging with those works. The works were focused on connecting the clinical environment of the hospitals in Galway with the nature and landscape of the west of Ireland. So even though this was not the intended purpose, this became a way for me to connect with the outdoors through my restricted indoor setting. Though I was not in a hospital environment, I was still in a restricted indoor setting. So by finding alternate ways to experience outdoors had become a much larger social need by then. So this work took on a particular relevance in this context. And as I was listening to the work, I was really thinking about the question of the how and when of my interaction with the work were crucial elements in my experience of the work. There were no gallery lights, there were no soundproofing elements in my room, there was no high-end speakers, but still the experience of my work was very simple, heartful, and freeing, perhaps very different from how it would have been if I was doing it in a typical gallery setting. So the digital experience was a way for me still, even though I was in my room, to see the city, to experience the west of Ireland, to feel the environment, to hear the sounds, and do all of those things which I could do outdoors if I was not in my quarantining period. So it was totally different from walking around the city, dropping into galleries and museums and watching performances. But still, I feel through this matrix of pixels, like how I'm talking to you now, the work was a way in which my artistic bond with the city was taking shape, the initial bond with the city. So that's what I talk about in my work for the journal.
Thanks. I mean, that raises that larger question of the experience of virtualization, which has been obviously at the absolute center of all of our experiences in the last year. And one of the questions is really what the long-term effects of that will be. But I think there's also an ethical dimension in what you're doing. And that seems to me to bring together a lot of the contributions today, that they're not only reflecting on the nature of creativity itself, which we can think of as a form of entrepreneurship and of innovation and of having various different sources of stimulation, but also of the ethical dimension of this moment. I think that for me is a kind of unifying theme. I'm aware of the time, and we've run over a little bit. So I think it remains for me to kind of draw things to a close and to thank all of you very much, first of all, for our attendees for being here, but above all for the panelists for taking part in the discussion, for taking us through in such an interesting way some of the challenges associated with this moment, but of thinking so forcefully and creatively and philosophically about the moment we're in and the opportunities that it presents. So thanks very much to all of you. Thanks also to David Kelly again for not only running things behind the scenes, but also for his role in the journal. So thanks again, everybody. Okay, recording is stopped.